Welcome to Fragmented, a software developer podcast where we talk about building good software and becoming better developers. My name's Don Felker.
And I'm Kaushik Gopal.
Welcome to the show. All right, Kaushik. So folks are pretty excited that we got the podcast back going. I know I'm excited. We kind of getting back here on a regular cadence, so it's good to be back.
It is. And as promised, we have today a topic that I've been wanting to ask for quite some time, actually. I know you mentioned you've dabbled a little with it in the past, and I've done minimal to almost nothing in this area.
Yeah.
I only know of it as a concept. I've seen and read about it, so I'm actually pretty curious to see where this goes. I have almost zero knowledge, and I've come intentionally with the idea of just peppering you with questions.
Okay.
Because I imagine a lot of folks also are in a similar position. So pretty much I wanted to ask you and pepper you with questions around serverless programming.
Yeah, for sure. So it's, I guess we should probably define what serverless really is.
That was going to be my first question.
Yeah. So for me, and this is probably not a textbook, I know it's not a textbook definition, but serverless is exactly what it sounds like. You really are not maintaining any servers whatsoever. And this could kind of go, I don't know, some people will say, well, look, I'm running on my apps, running on my APIs, running on Heroku. It's serverless. I can see it's managed, but it's actually a server. When we're talking about serverless today, what we're really talking about is using something like AWS Lambda functions as almost a way to power your application. So you really don't have any servers that you're managing. You're not managing any VPCs. You're not managing any instances. They're not running at all times. They're only running while the function is executing its code, and then basically it shuts back down. There are some caveats to that, but that's kind of the principle behind it. And there's a lot of benefits and also a lot of challenges that come along with kind of developing an application in that way.
So in a very typical traditional application, right? I'm trying to think about say you spin up a Rails web application or something. If you do it on the local, most likely people don't see this, but when you spin up a server, your computer, your local machine happens to be the server, right? So you actually have to write Rails console or whatever. And the first gradual step that most people take is deploying it into something like Heroku. Heroku is very simple. And in the early days, it was one of the most popular services it was least touch, where it would just you could deploy directly from Git or something, and then it'll just load it onto Heroku and it'll spin up.
Yeah, there's a platform as a service, yeah.
Oh, platform as a service, yeah. That's probably the official term. But in all of those cases, you still had to manage. You still had to own a Heroku account. You still had to push to Heroku. You still have to add dynos. That's their server kind of thingy, right? So all that is definitely managing servers. And the next logical step for companies that grow bigger than that is where you get into AWS land, right? Where you have application servers, you have ELBs, you have all that stuff. So I guess my question is, you're saying I don't need any of that. You obviously need some service. There are some servers, but you don't have to manage them. You don't have to add, say oh my God, I'm getting a lot of load today because Hacker News or something discovered my website. I don't necessarily have to keep scaling more servers. Is that how this works? Or what happens? What happens in that scenario? Because that's traditionally the thing in my head that seems to appeal. If I don't have to do that, I'm happy, right?
Yeah. So I think the best way to explain this is kind of the use case that I went down for playing with serverless. So, I'd say I'll kind of give a little backstory here before we get into the real nitty gritty. A little over a year and a half ago, I wrote a little command line script using JavaScript. I wanted to post a GIF to Instagram for fun. But as most people, some people know probably, you can't just grab a GIF from your phone or whatever and upload it to Instagram. It's just different file format. A lot of times GIFs are not long enough to post to Instagram. I think they need to be 1.5 or 3 seconds long. I forget, it's in my code somewhere. And it has to be an MP4, a certain format, blah, blah, blah. Etc. So I wrote a script to actually transform a GIF into an MP4 file, and it worked. And I was very happy with it, and I used it a few times, and eventually I kept using it here and there for fun. And then I realized, you know what, this would be something very useful to somebody else. And so I ended up just creating a Node.js application that would do that for me. Now, the challenge there is if you've seen GIFs can be quite large, megs, very large. And if you upload them, you need a place to put them. Well, in Heroku, the file system is ephemeral. I forgot to say that properly.
That's right.
Ephemeral, which means it doesn't persist. It's really you have to consider it's just going to go away at any time. And the space is limited, and then you have the scaling problems. And so I initially built a Node.js application, and it worked. But the problem is the processing time that it took to transform these GIFs into MP4 videos was very processor intensive. And I get a few requests in there, and it just starts bottlenecking immediately. And I was like, this is not going to work unless I have a very beefy server, and that's going to just cost a ton of money. And I kind of had to take a step back and said, well, if I want to create this this site that allows you to upload a GIF and then you just get back an MP4 file you can post to Instagram, how am I going to do this? Now, this kind of sidesteps software a little bit into the side project land that we all get into every once in a while. We have an idea for an app, and then we think, how can I make money on this? And I'm guilty of this with everything. I'm like,
you're the king of this. You've done this quite a few times, right?
I can't. Yeah, if I can't turn this into an app that I can productize, well, then maybe I shouldn't make it. I finally got over that fear. I don't even fear, just that roadblock about a year ago when I listened to a podcast from Josh Pigford. It's called Founder Chats. He's actually the host of the podcast. And he did an episode where he interviewed himself, which is kind of weird, but he talked about all of the products that he has built as side projects by himself. He's the founder of Baremetrics, which is a SaaS analytics tool. And so he actually has written many applications and has had successful blogs and he said he sold many different software products. And to make a really long story short, what he does is if he finds interest in something, and I'm really dumbing this down, he'll build it, had fun with it, learn it, put it out there for the world to use. And then if for whatever reason people start using it, if he can figure out a way to productize it and make money, then he will. If not, then he's just like, well, either I'm tired of this or I don't know what else to do. He'll just throw it up on some type of site like Flippa, and then just kind of flip the site. Now, he may make a few $100, a few thousand, 10,000, 20,000, who knows? He may just decide to sell it. And so that's kind of the impetus of what I decided to do. I said, well, if I want to build something and I don't know how to make money on it, I don't want to have to spend a ton of money to just run this service. And I just didn't want to have to be pouring hundreds of dollars out every month for something that was free for people that didn't really do anything. It was just a kind of a large piece of overhead for me. And so I started doing research and I said, well, how can I keep the costs low?
Yeah, quick question though, just some follow-up questions to this stuff, because I'm jotting some questions down. You said Flippa. What exactly is Flippa? Is that something that just allows you to monetize something quickly?
Yeah, it's flippa.com, FLIPPA.com. It's as their tagline on their website says, it's the number one marketplace to buy and sell software businesses, apps, I think even digital services, domains, all different kinds of stuff like that. Even Shopify stores, FBA stores, stuff like that. So if you have built a side project and it's running and you're just like, it works, I'm not interested in doing this anymore, I don't know what to do with it, I could just shut it down. You could just throw it on Flippa and say, hey, look, here's the analytics on it. Here's how much I've been doing it. I'll sell it for $1,000 or $2,000.
Oh, interesting. So you can sell the entire service.
Yeah, it's just go through a little bit of due diligence with the buyer to say, all right, well, let me see your analytics. Give me access to the analytics. Let me verify everything that you're saying. Can I see the code? There's different things, but that's where a very common place to do it. And there's a few sites like that.
That makes sense. The other question I had was, you mentioned Josh from Founders Chat said that, I'm going to try and put this up on a service. So I guess this is where we entered to serverless programming, right? I like the sound of that. But the problem is there's so much of this skeleton work that has to go that is involved in trying to get it up, right? For example, if I run this cool thing on my computer and I have a bunch of these services that I run locally, to get that up, I want to do that, but I don't want to deal with that, right? Because A, that's not my forte, and B, I could do that, but I'm curious what your thoughts are around that. Is this something where if you get over that hump once, then it just becomes easy and you keep doing it? Or how much work is involved in like trying to productize that, right?
Yeah, so I think productization and deployment of your application to a service environment are two definitely different tasks altogether. You could just be creating a tool that you need to deploy, and how you monetize that could be a completely different beast altogether, or even productize it. So for me, the intrinsic motivation was that I'm getting into a lot more web development. It's just been my core foundation all of my career, and it's something I have a deep love for and passion for. So I've always wanted to learn how to build a serverless application. I've heard a lot of friends talk about it. I've read a lot about it. And I said, well, after I realized I didn't want to spend a lot of money running a service, I said, well, how can I keep this cheap? And then I thought about this. I said, well, the way serverless applications work it's called a serverless, in AWS, they have something called a Lambda function. And basically, it's just a function. You provide some inputs, it performs some processing, and then you only get charged for how long that Lambda function is running. And so the maximum time a Lambda function can run is 15 minutes. So it's got to be under that. And even when it launched, I think it was only under 5 minutes.
Oh, that's crazy. I didn't know. So there are limitations. You can't just have like something running for the whole day. I mean, obviously, you have something going wrong terribly if you have a function that runs for a day. But, well, that's good to know. So it's 15 minutes.
Yeah, and you can configure that on your Lambda function. Say, hey, look, this Lambda function, it should time out after 2 minutes, or it should. And I think I've bought mine up to like 10 or 12 or something like that for very large files. It can just take a little while to chunk through. But on average, mine go through in seconds. So you only get charged that in that regard. And then let's say I fire up this application. It's on AWS Lambda. What do I need? I know I'm going to need a place I need to be able to upload a file. So I thought, well, I need file space. What's that? AWS has S3, so I can drop the file in S3. Cool. Then I need a way to trigger a Lambda function. So I need some type of API. They have an API gateway, which allows you to basically create endpoints into AWS. So I don't have to have a server. It's just kind of pointers saying, hey, when this endpoint is hit, do this, invoke this function, invoke this Lambda function. And then AWS will handle behind the scenes saying, all right, here's an input. It'll start that function up. And really what it does, and I'm really dumbing this down, is kind of just starts a container behind the scenes and just says, hey, you're running node 12 or 14, and here's the code. It'll just go up, execute the code. It'll start a little container with node and the dependencies installed, and then boom, it'll execute your code, and then it exits out and it's done. Now it will stay, there are some caveats to that. It will stay kind of warm for a period of time. So if you do have many requests coming in, that initial startup time can take a few seconds of the first time a function starts. So it will leave the container running for a second. So if you get a lot of requests, it'll just keep reusing that container over and over to save you that time. Now, so again, I need a file space, I need a place to execute, and I needed a database to store records. All those were available in AWS, and I wanted to learn all of them. And so it's kind of my impetus of like, cool, I'm going to build this product that actually has usefulness in the public. I have no idea if it's going to take off or do anything in the world, but it's an opportunity for me to actually learn how to use and build a serverless architecture-based application and put something out in the real world so I can have experience doing it.
Pretty slick. Do you plan to do like a Castor.io course on this where you like do, I don't know, man, that's interesting because the way you said it, I mean, I have a bunch of these like, throwaway services that I'd love to have because sometimes when I write these things and it's on one computer, if it's like on my personal computer and it's like a quick service and I have to access it from my work computer or something, it'll be nice to like just put it up for a service so that other people can use too. But again, the friction that I have with all of this is, okay, what's involved? I got to find out like AWS, S3. So having to step through that would be pretty cool.
Yeah, to be honest, I don't know if I'll do a course on it. It was, I got the initial application working fairly easily.
That's good to hear.
And how I did that is I just used Postman as my client, which is is basically a HTTP client to send requests up to AWS. And then inside of AWS, you can just do console log. Now, here's the thing about AWS that people may or may not know. AWS is like Legos. It literally is. They've learned how to productize everything. Like I needed to do logging to see what's going on inside of my function. It was failing. I didn't know where to go find the logs. I couldn't find them anywhere. I had to reach out to a friend of mine who's an AWS guy, and he said, oh, you need to turn on CloudWatch. was like, what's CloudWatch? He goes, oh, that's where their logs go. And I'm like, oh, I got to pay for that? And he goes, yeah. He goes, everything has been productized at Amazon. So I had to go turn on CloudWatch and then make sure the logging was enabled for the function that I was working within. And then, so it's kind of like I hopped through a lot of hoops. It wasn't an easy thing by any stretch of the imagination. And honestly, if I have to write, or I do write another application, I'm still going to lean towards my preferred stack, which is Rails.
That was going to be my question. Like, having done all of this, would you go back to using this, or like, is it a use case kind of thing?
It's definitely a use case thing. Now, if I knew, I'd probably build my, let's say I have a SaaS application, software as a service, subscription-based, whatever, for business-to-business use cases. But for whatever reason, it has some large processing thing. Maybe you upload a video, and then I'm going to go create 10 different sizes of that video for you, and I'm going to deliver them so you can, you can post them to Instagram, you can post them to YouTube and Vimeo and all, whatever, wherever you want to put them. I'll give you all the sizes you need for whatever reason. I wouldn't do that in Rails. Like, I would actually write the core application, all of that stuff in Rails, and maybe the upload button, and then it would just drop it off to S3. And then I would then, right tool for the right job, I would then use something like AWS Lambda to then do all that so I can scale it behind the scenes and then just communicate back to the Rails app saying, hey, I'm done. Here's where the locations of the files are at. So kind of a use case thing for each application. And I think AWS Lambda is really powerful for these different like one-off type tasks.
Got it. First thing is, what languages are supported? Like, you said AWS, and you said you did it with Node, which I imagine then JavaScript and like the Node.js environment is something. Can I use Rails? Can I use Kotlin perhaps to run on like AWS Lambda?
Now, I'm not sure if Kotlin is supported. Now, AWS, I'm reading the docs here as I say this, so full disclosure. As a doc state here, it supports Java, but I'm not sure about the Kotlin, runtime, all that stuff. Java, Go, PowerShell, Node.js, Python, and Ruby. Yep, those look like there. So to recap, Java, Go, PowerShell, Node.js, C#, Python, and Ruby. That's right. I missed C#.
I do see some like blog posts. A lot of blog posts talk about like, using Kotlin for serverless frameworks and AWS Lambda. So in theory, it looks like it is possible. But yeah, I guess like right out of the box, probably like those languages that you mentioned.
I'm looking online right now, and it does look like there's some blog posts on AWS Lambda where you could use Kotlin, which, to be honest, and this is personal opinion, if I ever have to write any Java code, I always just default to Kotlin anymore.
I'm pretty sure it's gotten to a point where I don't think I could like write Java as well anymore.
Oh no, not at all. I think one of the cool things about AWS though is, like, for example, let's say you have something written in Kotlin and it's like this massive, not massive, but it's like a lot of work you've put into it and it works really well. You can just, if you can run that in AWS, you can just take that, or Java, put it into that a function maybe that does something, has an input and output. You can put it in there, and then perhaps maybe it drops a file onto S3. You can actually have another Lambda trigger, which means say, hey, it just is like a watcher, and it says, hey, anytime a new file is created inside of this S3 bucket, go ahead and invoke this function and then tell me about that file. So you may do something in Kotlin, drop a file in there, maybe it's a big CSV file. I may pull it over and need to do some machine learning or R static analysis, some weird analysis on the file, and I may decide to do that inside of Python, because that's just the right tool for the right job, and they got great libraries for that. I can then have another function in Python. So I can kind of mix and match inside of the Lambda environment whatever I want for each function.
That's pretty interesting. So your GIF service or GIF service, okay, don't at me. One of those things, you did have to have like a Rails service running, because there is a web page, right? And I don't imagine you can run web pages on the serverless programming infrastructure, right?
That's a fantastic question. So I did build it all, like I said, with Postman, but I did need a UI. So I kind of went down that same route of like, all right, well then do I have a Heroku front end that runs on Rails? I'm like, all right, well then I'm back to paying for a server again. I don't want to do that. Right. And so what I ended up doing then is I went and I started using, I think, what's it called? They're called Vercel now. Have you heard of them?
No, not really.
So Vercel, Vercel. It's basically almost like I don't know the best way to put it. It's a highly developer experience focused company where I can just take some code and push it up and they'll run it. And so what I decided to do is I let me kind of explain my process here. Is I thought, well, I don't need a Rails app. I can run the entire application from Postman. So what does that tell me? That means I just need to be able to interact with an API. Okay. So I can do that in any language. It's like, okay, this is a perfect use case for React single page app. And so I was like, you know what? Let me do that. And so I created a simple, I can upload the screenshot. I still have it. It's the ugliest app I've ever created. It was dog ugly. But it worked, and it was all in React, and it just communicated with the AWS API gateway endpoints that I had developed. And then I was able to just upload a file and it worked. And so then from there, it's almost very similar to GitHub, except they connect to, not GitHub, very similar to Heroku, except I just push my code up to GitHub. I've connected Vercel to that GitHub repository. Vercel watches that repository, and anytime new code is pushed to master, it automatically deploys it to my endpoint. So within seconds of me pushing to master, I have a CI/CD pipeline that it's just built in. It just automatically deploys updates.
And what specifically does Vercel do that Heroku doesn't do? Is it just that Heroku is like heavier weight and Vercel is lightweight?
Yeah, exactly. It was just heavier weight. It's Vercel. I'm looking at the pricing page now. One of the big selling points here is HTTPS enabled custom domains, $0 a month. That's all I needed. Like, okay, I can do continuous deployment with Git and HTTPS with a custom domain. And so the domain of what the app we're talking about is called Gifstagram. So it's like Instagram, but just with their word GIF, Gifstagram. If you go to gifstagram.com, you'll see it.
Yeah, and I'll make sure to add that in the show notes. But
yeah. And so it's just, that's all it was, is I just put it up there and I let it run. And it's kind of just hosted up there. I don't have to worry about managing a server. It's just a single page app. I could have pushed this up to S3 and had S3 host it because I could have done everything in AWS. But at the time when I was developing this, of course, this wasn't going to make any money. This was a learning experience. I said, well, how can I just get this out there and be pragmatic and get it out to the public as quickly as possible with as least friction as possible? And Vercel was the answer at the time.
Okay. That's pretty cool. This already sounds super interesting. Again, I'm going to go down my list of questions. What changes about your application? For example, if in my mind, serverless programming means you can't necessarily hold state in a way, right? And I mean it differently, because you did mention that you're using S3, which in some ways is state, and the Amazon databases. So you do have state in that fashion. But typically when I write a Rails application, I presume local state, right? Like, active model, or like when I'm running an Android application, whatever, like I have like a lot of in-memory state, right? A lot of that, like, singletons and the like, all of that doesn't seem to exist in serverless programming. Do you have to go like all functional on this, and literally everything is a function? You just provide a function and it gives an output? How like
it's totally functional, yeah. And it's a different paradigm, man.
So that was like my question. What changes about the way you write an application? Because I'm sure there's like a change in mindset versus a typical web app, right?
Yeah, and I think I need to make note here that there is no login here, though I may eventually add it.
That was my other question. What do you do about authentication? But yeah.
Yeah, and at that point, you would have to treat it just as if you were with any API. You'd probably have to create some type of token, store that token with expirations inside of the database, and that's what I would end up doing when and if I get to that point, which it may. We do have people using it every day. But yes, it does change. There's no state except for the state that's persisted in a Postgres database, there's a caveat there. I'm not actually using the serverless version because there was some weird conflict in versions of which I was using. So I do actually pay for the database to be running, but there is a serverless option that you could use. I just, at the time building it, didn't want to fight a couple of dependency issues and just said, hey, I'll pay for the database for a little bit. But everything other than that is 100% serverless. So let's take into consideration what happens on Gifstagram. You plug in your email, and I need your email because everything on Gifstagram is serverless, and I don't know how long it's going to take. So I can't make it instantaneous to come back to you. Now, I could introduce some polling and probably, and to be honest, actually just WebSockets would be better, and that's on the feature list if this does get some more traction. But right now, we take an email and a file. And then once that happens, what I actually do is I take that file, I take your email, and then I see if you've already had you've already uploaded a GIF before. If you have not, your first one is basically, it's like free of charge kind of thing. And if I just upload it, and then I take the file and I upload it, and then process it, return it to you. Now, if this is your second time back, you're doing another GIF, to make sure that you're not abusing the email or spamming somebody, I do make you verify your email. So at that point, I say, oh, they've already been here before. They've already got their free one. Now I need you to verify your email to make sure that you're not abusing the system. And that's just for protection of everybody.
I was going to ask that too. Like, how do you prevent people from just DDoSing this thing and just going and like constantly hitting you with requests?
Yep. So. Yeah. So they could hit me with requests. It just returns back, I forget what one of the HTTP codes that says, hey, this, so I return, and that's another thing. Since I don't have state anywhere, I kind of have to maintain a list of error codes somewhere. And many applications do this is, error code 12 is this and error code 13 is this. So I have a mapping of when this code happens, this means will happen somewhere in the system. And then the client can react accordingly. So when the file gets up to S3, by that point in time, I've actually already know that the user's email address and so forth. But the file to get to S3 is going to be put into an S3 bucket. It's not a publicly accessible S3 bucket. So one of the cool things that S3 has is actually the ability to create secure posting URLs, which you can actually lock down in S3 saying, hey, I need you to create a secure URL that's only valid for the next number of minutes. I only want you to be able to post up to like a 50 meg file. And then when that file is uploaded, I also want you to apply this metadata to the file. And that's just metadata that's stored at S3. So what I'll actually do is I'll take the user's, their ID, it can be like ID 12, and I'll just apply that as, 12 metadata inside of the file. And then at that point in time, the file ends up in S3, and then as soon as the UI comes back, says, hey, we're processing your file, we'll email you when we're done. Now on the back end, a whole bunch of processes kick off from S3 triggers. S3 says, Lambda says, hey, there's a new file on S3. It then looks at that file and then inspects the metadata and say, hey, this file is for user ID number 12. And then it starts processing that file. And then based upon whatever happened, does it encounter an error? Does it bomb out? There's all different, try-catch scenarios in here. Let's say it succeeds. Once it's done, I then actually create a message in a message queue and say, hey, this is done processing, notify the user. And I put it up in a queue. And the reason why I put it in a queue is because I wasn't sure if I wanted to use the fan out principle, which is where you put a message inside of a message queue and you can fan it out to many different consumers. Right now, I only have one consumer, which is just an email notifier. And then what happens is it says, hey, this file with this ID is done. And then it just takes it, generates another secure get URL that's only valid for 1 hour, and then returns that back to users an email and says, hey, here's your file, download it now. It's only going to be available for an hour. And then there's a process automatically built into S3 that I've set up, which is just an expiration policy. It says, hey, any file that's older than an hour, automatically delete it. So I keep my costs low and I'm not storing a bunch of files.
Man, that is beautiful, but it's also, everything is like a hook on hook, right? Like you have to it's like, it just makes me think, I was like, wow, one of those things in the chain breaks, then pretty much like it's like killed throughout, right?
And that's the big challenge is when I built this, the happy path is always the easiest, right? It's just weird one-off paths. And so thankfully, when I got this kind of working in a state, I put a call out for some people to test it, and they're actually on Gifstagram.com/credits. These are all the folks that had helped a lot. Many different bug reports of people that had run into stuff. And I found one of the big challenges with this architecture is tracing requests. Like, because a request comes in, a function executes, boom, we drop a file somewhere else. Some other function picks it up. That processes, boom, we end up in a queue somewhere. Boom, we end up in Amazon, SES, which is simple email service. Maybe that fails. Maybe that kicks off another process. All different kinds of things can go haywire wrong. So I had to start building in like request IDs. Like, all right, this is a unique request ID. And then I can start tracing that request through. And so when someone had a problem, they'll say, hey, I uploaded the file. It didn't work. I didn't get an email. I can then trace it through, like, oh, wow, this weird thing happened in the processing. Didn't anticipate that. Let me write a try catch around that.
Yeah. So like it's almost like you have to, it makes sense. It's like your RX Java chain, right? Where you have to account for everything. That's nice. I'm looking at a GIF diagram, by the way. It's like pretty cool. What do you do for the design and stuff? Like is this, as in, well, not design, for the front end?
The front end is written in React. So the front end is written in React. The CSS, I'm using Tailwind UI. Not Tailwind CSS.
Tailwind CSS, interesting.
Yeah, and then I actually went and found a template online, which is what you're seeing here. And then I just modified the template quite a bit and found a bunch of free vectors, which is the vector you see on it's not a vector, it's a PNG, but it's from a vector. That's from a site called freepick.com. And then underneath it, there's some other vector looking images of images and stuff like that. And that's from another site called undraw.co. And you can just scroll to the bottom of Gifstagram. You'll see the credits down at the bottom, very left corner.
Credits. I see that. This is pretty slick. I like it a lot.
But yeah, it's been a challenge because just all the different moving pieces, and I think it would be only one of those cases where I would build something like this again as a use case. And I know someone else in the Rails community he was recently doing some stuff with some images, and he's delegating it off to AWS, almost the same thing that I'm doing here, not for GIFs, but for a different reason. And then he's communicating back with Rails, and it'd be one of those weird one-off situations, right tool, right time.
That makes sense. The other question I had was, how exactly does scaling work with this? Do you just throw more lambdas, or no? Is it all just handled? How does that work? Do you set it up?
Yeah, so I'm just logging in here. From my memory, it's been a few weeks since I've been in there. By default, you can burst up to a certain concurrency amount, and I think it's at 3,000. Basically 3,000 functions can be executing at once, which it'll burst up to, and then it will kind of slowly start kind of scaling back down. And it's dependent upon your region. So I think US East, where I'm at, is 3,000, West is 3,000, and I think other regions are like 1,000 and 500 have a concurrency limit of how much they'll handle. And then at that point, I think you start getting errors. But that's one of those situations of like, well, if I'm getting 3,000 requests basically a second or more, I have bigger problems that I need to worry about.
Your service is taken off at that point, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Then at that point, I need to figure it out. And so I didn't build this to anticipate 3,000 requests a second. It's just a GIF processor. But there are limits that are there. Oh, it says right here, request will fail with a throttling error 429 HTTP status code.
That makes sense. I had my last question, but I think in some ways you've already answered it. But say I wanted to build the next, I was going to say Pingstagram, but like that doesn't make sense. I was trying to replace the GIF with something else. How did you start with the idea? Was it just literally a bash or shell function on your local? How do I mimic this? You mentioned Postman, which is like, makes sense, but say, I wake up this fresh morning and I'm like, okay, I want to build this service. Where do you start? How did you start? Can you walk us through like each step and then how you move to a more productionized version of that step? Does that question make sense?
Yeah, the way that I started again was just a simple personal use case. I had that GIF. I wanted to turn it to an MP4. How do I do that? Started Googling around, figured out a bunch of different scripts out there that would do it, and I kind of just hacked together my own version that did what I needed. And then at that point, and it was a node at the time, so all I really did to run it was in my command line, I'd type node, the name of the script, and I'd pass in a file name. So it's like pop, pop, pop on the command line and enter, and then it would just output right to the screen, and then I would just console log, all done. And then my file would be where I expect it to be. Then at that point, it's like, all right, well, can I turn this into a web app? And that was, for me, that was my next logical step. I wasn't even thinking Lambda. Honestly, for the first 9 months, I didn't think Lambda. And in fact, I didn't even think that would turn this into anything. I thought it would just be a tool for me. And then once I decided it wasn't going to work as a regular web app because of concurrency and the processing time and all that, that's when I started figuring out like, well, where are the natural logical points where I have to break this apart? And that's why I started looking at my, it was a couple hundred lines long. It's like, all right, what am I doing inside of here? I'm processing, I am uploading a file. I am processing a file. I am handling error conditions. I'm sending emails. And so like, all right, each one of these is their own unique thing. Like I need one function that just handles uploading the file and writing a record to the database. That's all it does. And then boom, from there, the next one would be, all right, now it's going to process the file. And so to do that, I kind of had to learn how AWS worked with serverless and what the triggers were. And the cool thing with AWS is you don't have to use like S3 for a trigger. You can use a whole bunch of things as triggers, such as maybe something in a database. You could use something in SQS, which is simple queuing service. Perhaps some type of failure somewhere else could kick off a function. Any number of things could kick off a Lambda function. For me, it was just all based around files and S3. And so as soon as those files started coming in, I knew I had to process it, and when it was done, I would drop it into another bucket, which would be like a completed bucket in S3. And then a different Lambda function would be invoked at that point in time to do something else. So just finding the natural logical breaking points of like, all right, kind of almost breaking things apart into what they should be doing in the first place. So instead of kind of having one monster function or one monster file, just break it apart into regular software that we've been doing and just passing the parameters in and then figuring out how to put that into a Lambda function so that they can kind of scale out from there.
It makes a lot of sense. I wanted to call this out. In the typical web application land, most people talk about things like Redis, right? And in some ways, like if you want to like build something but also keep state and not go the serverless route, that's like one of the options that people use, right? For example, if you're running Rails web application and you have something, and even if it's a regular API, right? Say you're hitting an external API call, and that call happens to take, I forget what it is, it's 30 seconds or something, right? Like it's pretty short. So if that API takes 30 seconds to respond, so it isn't even your application, it's just literally an external API is taking long, I know you'll get a timeout. Well, you won't locally, but if you put it on any platform as a service, like for example, Heroku will time out in like 30 seconds, right? And traditionally, what most folks tend to do as they build web applications is then make use of like, queuing service, like you mentioned, right? Like some message queuing service. And then Redis is an extremely popular one that's like super fast. So, I mean, it's funny because in the mobile application, like this is the only part about mobile programming that's like simpler in my mind, because I don't have to worry about like doing these things. It's all in there, right? I can just wait and then I can like respond to that. But in web application land, that gets a little tricky, because if you think about it, you're moving to a background process, responding on the UI. And unlike mobile, like the UI, it works differently. You need to like have something that's polling or something in the background, right? In order to ping that queuing service and like respond to those reactions. And then it gets like tricky because then you need authentication tokens and like a lot of that stuff. So, the web does have its challenges from that aspect. And there's like one of the few things that are like maybe in some ways simpler in mobile programming.
Yeah, I agree. I use, for example, on caster.io, I use Redis quite a bit in the background, which is processed through Sidekick, which is a open source job scheduler in Ruby. So I use that all the time. But yeah, it's one of those things, and that's kind of one of the things that I had to think about a lot with Gifstagram is processing GIFs can, depending upon the file size of the GIF, it's a 30 meg GIF and it's a 15-second GIF, like it can be quite substantial. It's going to take some processing power, and if 30, 40, 50, 2 minutes long to process through it, based upon the load, I couldn't have the client waiting for that. So that's why I had to kind of drop it into S3 and say, hey, we're going to email you when we're done. And that's what ends up happening is they just email with a link where they can download the file. And that's, I'm treating S3 really kind of almost as its own little message queue in a way.
Yeah, you're able to do that because the triggers are so powerful that you can
Yes.
say when X happens and Y happens, do this, right?
Exactly, yeah.
And stepping back, right, it sounds like this was like a fun project and it sounds really cool, but you started off this entire process with the idea of making this more cost effective, right? So I'm trying to recount, did it land up being more cost effective? And were you to build Giftstagram again, would you use a similar process, or would you just say, you know what, screw it, I'm just going to use like a regular Rails server, and then you go back to using something like Redis and Sidekick and waiting?
For this use case, I would probably do it the same way again. If it was anything else, if it wasn't file processing, I'd just go back to Rails and Redis or whatever.
That makes sense. And because like just in terms of cost, it does land up being pretty effective.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I can look at the processing time on the Lambda function. With platform as a services, you're paying for that server all day long. It's
Uptime,
always running.
Right? Like,
yeah, it's always running. It's always running. With AWS Lambda, I'm only paying for the execution time. And there's days sometimes when it's just, maybe it's a Sunday, no one's posting any gifts, and maybe I'll get a couple of users or none at all. I don't pay for it.
That's true. So that's where it becomes, especially as it's growing, it becomes extremely like cost effective, because yes, say if everyone's using Giftstagram like every second, at that point maybe like the cost, you may not necessarily see that big a difference in cost again, or maybe you would, I'm not too sure. But it makes perfect sense. Why it becomes really powerful, as you're saying, is because when you have the down days, you're not paying for any of it, right?
Yeah, and one of the other things that I wanted to not worry about is this is a product that people are going to use, but it's a free product. And at the end of the day, it doesn't bring me any money whatsoever. It was an experiment to see if I could build something with AWS. I did. I put it out there. And one of my rules that I had set for myself is like, I don't want to create any more work for myself. I don't want to have to monitor something all the time. I don't want to have to worry about adjusting dynos or scalability issues. If for some reason this got picked up by some blog and I didn't know about it and I'm out eating dinner somewhere, like the last thing I'm going to want to have to worry about is like, oh goodness, one of my products just took off. I need to worry about scaling right now. Hold on, let me go out to the car. Like, no, with this Lambda stuff, like 3,000 burst connections, like go for it. Like, fine, I'm going to eat dinner. And maybe the bill will be a little bit higher. That's cool with me. So that's kind of one of my big requirements is I just didn't want to have to worry about it that much.
This makes a lot of sense. My one of my last few questions was, how many options are there? So AWS server, like AWS Lambda was one of them. I know Azure has something from Microsoft as well. Did you explore all of the options? Was it mostly because AWS is like the leading player? Did you look at other options?
Yeah, I considered going over to AWS Azure Functions because that's a very similar thing over there. But the reason why I decided to go with AWS is just simply because it's the largest player out there. And if I'm getting back into more web development, I just wanted to have more experience with AWS. I think I've even talked to you before. You've worked with companies that run on AWS. The number of times in my consulting career I've run across someone who runs on Azure, I can count on one hand. The number of times I've run across clients that run on AWS, I've simply lost count. So from a consulting perspective, knowing AWS makes me much more marketable. So I figured that's where I'm going to go put my time and effort.
That makes sense. I think that makes perfect sense. I didn't have too many other questions, but this is pretty good. I'm just trying to recount the advantages. So one is like, I don't have to like necessarily manage any servers. Mm-hmm. The second is like the ephemeral aspect of it, right? So you don't have to have it running all the time. And then finally, obviously, because of that, it becomes pretty effective from a cost standpoint, right?
It does, yeah.
And the disadvantages, I was going to recount. What exactly are the disadvantages that you think, having gone through this whole process?
It's a lot more complex than, this is a very simple service. This was a simple single line command line application. Now when I'm running it in a serverless environment, I have to anticipate all different types of things happening. I can't be real time with the user. Everything's communicated through emails or whatever. Many different services are involved. So it's much more complex than I anticipated. And just, for example, just tracing, logging.
Yeah, I was going to say debugging must have been a freaking nightmare, right?
Debugging is a pain. Yeah, it was a pain.
If something, your email service just happened to go down for a second, you have no freaking clue what's happening, right?
And trying to figure out where to go to learn that. And after discussing things with a few AWS like architect level folks, there's people who just build their entire careers around AWS. Like that's what their specialty is, AWS. That's how big this beast is. So it's definitely far more complex than I would ever like it to be. And that's, again, the reason why if it was anything else, I will go back to Rails for everything else.
Damn. Any last thoughts on this before we call it?
No, the only thought that I have is everybody asks me a lot, like, hey, Don, what should I go learn right now? Should I be learning Android? Should I learn Flutter? Should I go learn JavaScript? Should I go learn something? Find something you're interested in and just go learn it. Like, it doesn't matter if it's, statistical programming with R. Like, if that's your jam, go for it. There's demand for it. There's so many opportunities out there. Don't let the landscape, especially of AWS, if you would look at the number of AWS services, I've just barely scratched the surface on all the different types of services. There's ones that are just unbelievable. So don't let any of that, scare you at all. There's documentation. You can always ask on Stack Overflow. Just go out and experiment and play.
That makes perfect sense. And it goes back to the advice we gave in one of our previous episodes, right? I don't think we should be learning technology per se, right? Like, don't learn Kotlin because, there is a use case for that. But if you are looking to get into programming as just something that you want to dip your toes, as a programmer, obviously, right? Like, if you're someone like Don and you're like, okay, I work as a contractor, like as a developer contractor. Yeah, I need to learn AWS, right? And that makes sense. But even the way you went about it, I think makes sense. You need to find the biggest problem with learning programming or anything to do with development is having the motivation to just power through stuff, right?
Yeah.
And the most powerful factor in that is trying to build something for yourself, right? If this is something that you need, you will end up learning a whole bunch of things, right? Like, so many people have built their development careers around that. I want this app that does this thing for me on my mobile phone. Okay, great. How do I build this mobile app, right? That's how a lot of developers start out. If, for me, a lot of my scripting stuff comes from wanting to run these scripts on my local machine, right? And then that's how I learn a lot of core Unix and Linux and a lot of that kind of stuff. Web application, obviously a lot of us started there. I started my career like that. I was I just want to put a web page, right? It was HTML, CSS, front-end development, CSS, SCSS, all that stuff, and that's how I learned. And none of that was because I was paid directly for it. My first paid job was a very traditional Java web development, Oracle-y, very traditional in a very traditional sense. But I got into it only because of wanting to build a web page, wanting to build my own blog. And even to this day, with my blog, that's where I use it as a learning channel because I want to do something very specific, as the owner of my blog. And that's how I research. Do I have to do it? No, but it keeps me motivated and I find it as a mechanism of learning. And I think that's the most powerful way to learn anything, right? For you, it feels like with Gifstagram, it was, I need to get the service, so let me power through the different things. If I told you, hey, Don, go and do this without the idea of Gifstagram, just go learn AWS Lambda functions.
Oh, I've been lost.
You'll probably read blog posts for about an hour and then you'll just give up, right?
Totally. Yeah, you gotta have a goal. I think one thing people get too hung up on is, especially beginners, and I know I'm guilty of this, is when I first started out, I think, I have this idea, I'm on my, let's just say I have a Roku, right? Which is a TV, internet TV player. I want to create a Roku app that will let me bookmark specific television shows, and then I can share that with all of my friends, and then they can rate it and upvote it, and then I'll provide recommendations to people who also like the same things I like. That is a humongous project. You just gotta kind of scale it back a little bit. Say, hey, is there just a way that I can even bookmark a show? Okay, how do I do that? Then just do that. Can I bookmark it? Can I put it on the web somewhere? Is it shareable? Right there, you've just exposed so many problems you need to go solve first. Just go down that route, and wherever it leads you, those are going to be the things that you learn. And it could be programming, could be script, could be being introduced to a particular type of programming environment. And then if that programming environment allows you to write Kotlin and Kotlin, do it there. If it's JavaScript or Python, then maybe you need to use that. But definitely having that goal is going to help you. And I think your keyboard examples are key prime candidate of that.
Thank you very much, sir. Is there anything else that you want to say before we wind this down?
Nope, not at all. Just quick Thanks to everyone who helped test Gifstagram. They're all located on gifstagram.com/credits. Again, if you're wanting to test out the service and play with it, it's free for anyone to use. Just go to gifstagram.com, and thanks for listening.
Also, this is a very different time, but I want to call out this, in all likelihood, is going to be our 200th episode.
Oh, wow.
I know.
That is amazing.
We came this long.
Yeah, thank you all for listening. And if you're new, thanks for starting us on this journey. Kaushik, when we first started, you reached out to me from a cold email. We covered this before, but we didn't know each other. You just cold emailed me. I'd like to start a podcast. We have the same thought process around some software practices, and let's chat. And we both decided to give it a shot and said, hey, let's just go for 10 episodes. Let's kind of agree to that on a friendly handshake, and we'll see how we feel after 10. And we kept reiterating and reevaluating, I think, every 10 for the first 50 or 60, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, first like 50 or 60, every 10 episodes, we would check in and try to make sure that we were doing well.
Yep. And so here we are at 200. So that's amazing. Wow. Kaushik, thank you for joining me on this journey too.
Absolutely. And thank you for agreeing to that first cold email. I even remember the first few episodes, like we would see 100 listeners and we're like, oh my God, 100 people listen to this thing that we just put out there. Fragmented has come quite some ways since then. And we hit snags and we had to pause in between. I know we're going to get this question a lot. Folks are like, oh, why don't you try to do something special for the 200th episode? We don't want to do anything right now because we just feel that the time is not exactly right. There's a lot of stuff going around in the world that we want to just take note of. We are also part of this world in many ways. And so we want to this is a huge monumental achievement for both of us. And we're extremely grateful to our listeners for having come through this journey with us, right? So we definitely do intend to at some point try to celebrate that. I know we've gotten a lot of ideas. People are like, oh my God, why don't you come up with a new design for your t-shirt? We'll get that. We have a lot of those ideas and we're just churning on them. It just we're just getting our bearings back. We want to double down and focus on the thing that we love doing, which is just recording and talking about technology.
Yes.
And we'll definitely get there.
Yeah, getting back on the cadence that we had is one of our number one goals. So we have more shows to put out there. So more goodness to come.
Peace, brother. That's it for the show, folks. Fragmented is hosted by Don Felker and me, Kaushik Gopal. We edit and produce all the episodes here on Fragmented. You can find more Fragmented episodes at fragmentedpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we will catch you in the next episode.